On the evening of October the 29th, 1997, an 18-year-old named Ronnie Greene Jr. was standing outside a convenience store in Pontiac, Michigan. He was with two friends. It was a Wednesday. The sun had already gone down. From roughly 280 feet away, hidden in a cluster of trees on a low hill across the street, someone raised a .22 caliber rifle aimed in the direction of the store and fired a single round that struck Ronnie Greene in the head. Greene collapsed. One of his friends was grazed by a separate bullet but survived. Paramedics arrived and rushed Greene to the hospital, where he died the next day from the wound. He was 18 years old. He had no connection to the shooter. He did not know who had pulled the trigger. Neither did anyone else standing near the store that night. When police finally identified their suspect 2 days later, they found him at Lincoln Middle School in Pontiac. He was sitting in a 6th grade classroom. He was wearing face paint from a Halloween party. He stood about 4 feet 9 inches tall and weighed roughly 65 pounds. His name was Nathaniel Abraham. He was 11 years old. To understand how an 11-year-old boy came to fire a rifle at a person he had never met, you have to understand the place he came from. Pontiac, Michigan sits about 30 miles northwest of Detroit. By the late 1980s, it was a city in decline. The auto industry that had built it was pulling away. Factories had closed or moved. The jobs that remained were lower paying, harder to keep, and never quite enough. The population was shrinking, but the problems were not. Poverty concentrated in pockets of the city. Public services frayed. Schools struggled for funding, and in the neighborhoods closest to the old industrial corridors, families lived stacked on top of each other in houses that were too small, on blocks that were too forgotten. For decades, Pontiac had been a company town. General Motors had its headquarters there. The factories employed thousands. The wages were good. The neighborhoods were stable. Then the layoffs started. Then the plant closures. Then the white flight that hollowed out the tax base and left behind a city that was disproportionately black, disproportionately poor, and disproportionately ignored by the state government in Lansing. By the early 1990s, Pontiac's violent crime rate was among the highest in Michigan. Drug trafficking had moved in to fill the economic vacuum left by the auto industry. The crack epidemic, which had already devastated cities like Detroit, Newark, and Los Angeles, arrived in Pontiac like a slow flood. Not dramatic enough to make national news, but relentless enough to reshape entire neighborhoods. The police department was understaffed and underfunded. The school system was in crisis. Social services existed on paper, but were stretched so thin that a mother asking for help with a troubled child could spend weeks being shuffled between agencies, each one pointing to the next, none of them willing to act. Pontiac in the 1990s was a place where a single mother with 6 children could work 2 jobs and still not keep her household together. It was a place where the police knew certain blocks by name, not because they patrolled them well, but because they were called there repeatedly. And it was a place where children, too many of them, raised themselves. Nathaniel Abraham was born in 1986, the same year Ronald Reagan was still in office, the same year CNN had become a fixture, the same year the crack epidemic was beginning to hollow out inner cities across America. By the time Nate was learning to walk, a crisis was already building. Between 1980 and 1994, the number of juvenile homicide offenders in the United States doubled. FBI clearance statistics from that period showed that the share of all homicides in the country attributed to juveniles grew from 5% to 10%. The quick explanation was drugs. The crack trade had flooded into inner cities, and it did not take long before drugs, guns, and children became entangled in the same supply chains. Drug traffickers discovered that children made excellent recruits. They worked as low-level sellers, carriers, and lookouts. They worked for less money. They took greater risks, and when they were caught, their age shielded them from serious punishment. From a dealer's perspective, they were ideal. It was not long before those same children came into contact with the firearms, and they began carrying them, not always because they needed to, but because guns had become a status symbol, an emblem of the drug-dealing lifestyle that surrounded them. In 1976, fewer than 2/3 of juvenile homicide offenders used a gun. By 1994, 82% of them did. This was the world Nathaniel Abraham was born into. The government's response to this spike in juvenile violence was not to address the root causes. It was to change the law. As the 1980s progressed, a growing number of states began passing legislation that allowed children under 17 to be tried as adults for certain crimes. The slogan was simple. Supporters marched in the streets with banners that read, "Adult crime, adult time." By 1992, more than 40 states had passed laws enabling the trial of children as adults, but no state's version matched the severity of Michigan's. In 1996, the Michigan legislature overhauled its juvenile code. The new law, informally known as Get Tough on Juvenile Offenders, eliminated any minimum age for a child to be tried as an adult. Under the statute, a prosecutor could charge a juvenile of any age in adult court, provided the crime was serious enough and a judge found probable cause. Any age, there was no floor. When a state senator who had pushed for the law was asked whether a child as young as 4 could theoretically be tried as an adult, his answer was yes. The law was passed in 1996, 1 year before Nathaniel Abraham picked up a rifle. Nathaniel was one of 6 children. His father left months after he was born and never returned. His mother, Gloria, worked 2 jobs to keep the family from going under. She worked days, she worked nights, she was almost never home. That meant Nate's formative years were spent under the supervision of his older siblings, children themselves. There was no father in the house, no consistent adult presence, no one whose primary role was to watch this particular boy and correct the things that needed correcting. And from a very young age, there were things that needed correcting. Nathaniel began exhibiting antisocial behavior early. Many children display these tendencies when they are young. Most parents notice them, intervene, and redirect, but no one was around to do that for Nate, so the behavior grew. It did not moderate, it escalated. By the time he was 9 years old, Nathaniel Abraham had become a child with the rap sheet of a middle-aged career criminal. The progression did not happen overnight. It happened in stages, each one slightly worse than the last, each one slightly more dangerous, and at each stage there was a moment where someone, a teacher, a police officer, a social worker, a judge could have intervened. None of them did, not because they were malicious, but because the systems they worked in were not designed to catch children like Nathaniel. They were designed to process them, to document the behavior, file the report, and move on to the next case. The paperwork was always up to date. The intervention was always someone else's responsibility. Between the ages of 9 and 11, Nate had 22 documented encounters with police. Some were for arson, others were for assault. Several were for breaking and entering. At least 5 of those incidents involved the use of a weapon. In one, he beat a 14-year-old boy with a steel pipe. In another, he assaulted an adult bus driver. He threw rocks at neighbors' houses. He threatened other children on the block. One neighbor, an 11-year-old girl, later told reporters that when they were both 9, Nate had threatened her with a gun. At some point, he became such a problem in his neighborhood that one resident moved out of the area entirely because of him. That same neighbor would later say, with an accuracy that no one appreciated at the time, that someday Nate was going to kill somebody. 22 police encounters in 2 years, and the boy was not yet 12. Gloria Abraham was not oblivious to what was happening. She knew her son was in trouble. She felt it. She watched it escalate, and she tried to get help. She went to the police, asking them to intervene in her son's behavior. They referred her to the juvenile court. When she got to the juvenile court, they sent her back to the police, telling her that her word alone was not enough. No one helped. No one intervened. The police would not act without a formal report from someone else. The juvenile court would not act without police involvement. Gloria was caught in a loop, and every day that the loop continued, Nate drifted further. At one point, Gloria found a weapon in her home. She turned the gun into police herself. It was a direct plea for help, a mother handing authorities physical evidence that her child was in danger, or was becoming a danger, and asking them to do something. They took the gun. They did nothing else. To understand Nate's world is to understand a system, not a formal organization, but a pattern of behavior that had become routine in neighborhoods like his across inner-city America in the 1990s. Children in these environments did not merely witness violence, they participated in it. They moved through a hierarchy, one that had nothing to do with school grades or family structure and everything to do with access to weapons, access to older boys who carried them, access to the streets at hours when no responsible adult was watching. Nate fit into this world seamlessly. There is no confirmed record of drug dealing on his juvenile sheet, but the pattern is unmistakable. He had access to firearms despite the fact that his mother did not own one. He roamed freely at hours that no 11-year-old should have been outside. He knew how to handle a rifle before he could write a proper paragraph. The children who lived inside this system did not think of what they were doing as criminal. Not at that age. They did not sit down and calculate risk. The regions of the brain responsible for impulse control, long-term planning, and consequence evaluation are not fully developed in adults until the mid-20s. In an 11-year-old, those neural structures are barely formed. The science is unambiguous on this point. What existed in their place was imitation, mimicry, status seeking. Nathaniel Abraham did what the boys around him did. And what the boys around him did was carry weapons, test boundaries, and perform acts of violence to earn standing in a world that offered them nothing else to earn standing with. He was not a mastermind. He was not a criminal genius. He was an 11-year-old boy with an IQ of 70 and the emotional maturity of a 6-year-old, living in a city that had forgotten him, in a system that had never bothered to remember him in the first place. October 29, 1997, a Wednesday. Sometime during the day, Nathaniel Abraham stole a .22 caliber rifle. The weapon was old, it was rusted, it had no proper shoulder stock, the barrel was damaged. It was not the kind of gun a trained marksman would rely on for precision, but it was a gun, and Nate had it. Before the shooting at the convenience store, Nate had already been firing the rifle in his neighborhood. He shot at balloons, he practiced aiming, he fired at a neighbor's house, barely missing the occupant inside. And according to witnesses who would later testify, he told at least one friend that he was going to shoot somebody. That evening, Nate made his way to a cluster of trees on elevated ground near a convenience store. Below, in the glow of the store's exterior lights, a group of young men stood talking. One of them was 18-year-old Ronnie Greene Jr. Greene did not know Nathaniel Abraham. Abraham did not know Greene. There was no argument between them, no prior conflict, no motive that anyone has ever been able to establish. From roughly 280 feet away, the length of nearly a football field, Nate raised the rifle and fired. 2 shots went off that evening. The first missed, the second did not. A .22 caliber bullet struck Ronnie Greene in the head. Greene fell. His friends scrambled. One of them had been grazed by a round, but was not critically injured. Emergency services were called. Greene was rushed to the hospital, where he was placed on life support. He died the next day. Nathaniel Abraham went home. After the shooting, Nate did not run. He did not hide. He did not seem to fully register what had happened. According to prosecutors, Nate bragged about the shooting to friends afterward. He spoke about it openly. He was not careful. He was not strategic. He behaved, in fact, exactly the way an 11-year-old child with no concept of long-term consequences would behave after doing something that he had been told, by the culture around him, was worthy of admiration. The investigation moved quickly. Witnesses told police that a boy named Nate had been seen firing a rifle in the neighborhood that evening. Others confirmed that he had spoken about shooting someone. Within 48 hours, investigators had their suspect. October 31st, 1997, Halloween. Police officers arrived at Lincoln Middle School in Pontiac. They walked through the hallway and into a 6th grade classroom. Nathaniel Abraham was arrested in front of his classmates, still wearing face paint from a school Halloween party. He was read his Miranda rights. His mother was brought to the station. She gave consent for the interrogation to proceed. Nate was questioned for over an hour. At first, he denied everything, but after persistent questioning, he admitted to firing the rifle. He said he had been shooting at trees. He said he did not mean to hit anyone. When psychologists later evaluated him, they found that Nathaniel functioned at the cognitive level of a 6 to 8-year-old child. His IQ was measured at approximately 70. The boy, who had been interrogated by trained police detectives for more than 60 minutes, had the intellectual capacity of a 1st or 2nd grader. The family court judge who first reviewed the case, Judge Eugene A. Moore, initially suppressed the confession as involuntary, ruling that a child functioning at that level could not have meaningfully understood his rights. The Michigan Court of Appeals reversed that decision. The confession was allowed back in. The reversal was significant. It meant that the words of a child who, by the court's own earlier finding, could not comprehend the rights being read to him, would be used as evidence against him in an adult murder trial. The very system that acknowledged his limitations in one proceeding chose to disregard those limitations in another. This contradiction would shadow the entire case. The law acknowledged Nathaniel's youth. It accounted for it in certain procedural moments, but it never let that acknowledgement fundamentally alter the trajectory of his prosecution. He was young enough for his confession to be questioned, but not young enough to be spared an adult trial. He was impaired enough for psychologists to document, but not impaired enough for the system to redirect. The gap between what the system knew about this child and what it chose to do with that knowledge is, in many ways, the central tension of the entire case. The Oakland County prosecutor moved to designate Nathaniel Abraham's case for adult court. Under Michigan's 1996 statute, the same law that had set no minimum age, the mechanism was available. A probable cause hearing was held. Judge Moore found sufficient evidence. Nathaniel was formally charged with first-degree premeditated murder, assault with intent to commit murder for the non-fatal shooting of a neighbor named Michael Hudak, and 2 counts of felony firearm. First-degree premeditated murder. If convicted, the sentence was mandatory, life in prison without the possibility of parole. The defendant was 11 years old. The charges split the country. On one side were those who believed murder was murder, regardless of age. The slogan held firm for them: adult crime, adult time. They pointed to Nate's rap sheet, 22 encounters with police, assaults with weapons, arson, break-ins, and argued that this was not a misguided child. This was a pattern. On the other side were those who saw the prosecution as an obscenity. The ACLU of Michigan issued a statement declaring that the system had failed this child, and that punishment was not rehabilitation, and revenge was not justice. Amnesty International featured Nathaniel's face on the cover of a 1998 report about American juvenile justice practices. Reverend Al Sharpton attended vigils. The NAACP mobilized. Civil rights organizations across the country called the prosecution a disgrace. Gloria Abraham, Nate's mother, could not reconcile what was happening. The Oakland County prosecutor himself, David Gorsica, publicly admitted that the Michigan social system had failed to help Nathaniel despite his impaired intelligence and his long history of encounters with the law. He said he owed Gloria an apology. Gloria's response was blunt. An apology, she said, while still trying her child as an adult? She called it ridiculous, but Nate's neighbors did not see it the way the civil rights organizations did. One woman told reporters that Nate had threatened her grandsons repeatedly. She said he threw rocks at her mother's house. She called him dangerous. Another neighbor, an 11-year-old girl, confirmed that when they were both 9, Nate had threatened her with a gun. When the cameras started rolling, almost every neighbor on the block had something to say about Nathaniel Abraham, and almost none of it was sympathetic. Only one neighbor came to his defense. He did not deny what the boy had done. He did not dismiss the claims, but he said it was wrong to charge a child as an adult. He said Nate was not a devil. He was a broken child who made terrible decisions. One neighbor out of the entire block. The case attracted the attention of Jeffrey Fieger, a Michigan attorney who had built a career on cases that other lawyers would not touch. His most infamous client at the time was Dr. Jack Kevorkian, the physician known as Dr. Death for his advocacy of assisted suicide. Fieger took on Nathaniel's case pro bono. He did not charge the family a cent, and immediately he began filing a series of motions and appeals that delayed the trial by nearly 2 full years. Enough time, he calculated, to build a defense. The trial began on October 29, 1999, exactly 2 years after the shooting. Nathaniel Abraham was now 13 years old. He sat in the Pontiac courthouse before Judge Eugene Moore, flanked by Fieger on one side and Assistant Prosecutor Lisa Halushka on the other. National media were present. News cameras broadcast the proceedings across the country. The trial was unprecedented, not for the crime itself, but for the age of the defendant. On the opening day, Nate's appearance in the courtroom was striking. He was dressed in oversized prison garb. There were cuffs on his wrists and chains on his feet. When he was asked to raise his right hand, he raised his left. Halfway through the hearings, he began sobbing. For most of the trial, he looked lost. He was 13 years old. He was too young to drive a car, too young to drink, too young to vote, and he was sitting in an adult courtroom facing a jury of 12 adults charged with the first-degree murder. Prosecutor Halushka opened by writing a single sentence on a board for the jury to read. She said it was what Nathaniel had told his girlfriend days before the killing. The sentence read, "I'm gonna shoot somebody." The prosecution's case was built on 3 pillars. First, that Nate had stolen the rifle and practiced with it beforehand, evidence of planning. Second, that he had told people he intended to shoot someone, evidence of premeditation. And third, that after the shooting, he had bragged about it, evidence that he knew what he had done. Halushka called witnesses who supported each of these points. She presented forensic evidence linking the bullet to Nate's rifle. She noted that Nate had given conflicting stories to police, which she argued demonstrated consciousness of guilt. At closing, she told the jury that even an 11-year-old knows that if you stick a gun around and pull the trigger, blood will come out. Fieger's defense was, in some ways, simpler. He did not dispute that Nathaniel fired the gun. He could not. The boy had admitted it. What Fieger disputed was intent. He argued that the shooting was a tragic accident, that Nate believed he was shooting at trees near the store, not at people. To support this, Fieger brought in an expert marksman who testified that it would have been nearly impossible to deliberately hit a small target from more than 200 feet away with the old battered rifle Nate had used. An FBI ballistic specialist testified that the bullet entered Green's head from above, consistent with a trajectory that could have involved a ricochet off a tree. Fieger also called child psychologists who testified about Nathaniel's mental state. They confirmed that Nate had an IQ of approximately 70, and that, at the time of the shooting, his thought processes were equivalent to those of a 6 or 7-year-old. Figure argued that Nathaniel lacked the impulse control and the mental capacity to form the intent to kill. The prosecution brought their own psychologist who disputed the claim that Nate could not form intent, and so the jury was left with two versions of the same child. One was a cold, calculating boy who set out to kill. The other was a developmentally impaired child whose reckless firing of a stolen gun had led to a death he never planned. There were questions during the trial that no one had good answers for. The Constitution stipulates that a defendant be tried by a jury of their peers. Nathaniel Abraham's jury was composed entirely of adults. There was, of course, no mechanism for selecting a jury of 11-year-olds, but the gap was real. The people deciding this boy's fate had no experiential frame of reference for what it meant to be 11, to have an IQ of 70, and to grow up in a household where no adult was consistently present. When a journalist confronted the prosecution about this, they argued that the adult nature of Nate's crime and the severity of his consequences on the victim's family justified the adult proceeding. The law allowed it. Whether the law should have allowed it was a different question entirely. After approximately 18 hours of deliberation, on November 16, 1999, the jury returned its verdict. Not guilty of first-degree murder, not guilty of assault with intent to commit murder against Michael Hudak, not guilty on the weapons charges, guilty of second-degree murder. The jury had rejected premeditation. They did not believe the prosecution had proven that Nathaniel planned the killing in advance, but they did find that he had acted with malice, that when he raised the rifle and fired in the direction of people standing near a store, he possessed enough intent to cause death or serious harm. Nathaniel Abraham became the youngest American ever convicted of murder as an adult. He was 13 years old when the verdict was read. He had been 11 when he pulled the trigger. Judge Moore had three options. The first was the harshest, a prison term of 8 to 25 years in an adult facility. The second was a blended sentence, placement in juvenile detention until Nate turned 18, followed by a review. If he had been properly rehabilitated, he would be released. If not, he would be transferred to adult prison after turning 21 to serve the remainder of a 25-year sentence. This was what the prosecutors wanted. The judge chose the third option, the most lenient one available. Nathaniel would be sent to a maximum security juvenile detention center and remain there until the age of 21, at which point he would be released. Moore explained his reasoning. Sentencing an 11-year-old to adult prison, he said, would destroy any hope for rehabilitation. He urged the Michigan legislature to set a minimum age. He suggested 14, so that a case like this could never happen again. He was asking the state to fix the law that the state itself had written. Robin Adams, the mother of Ronnie Green, expressed sorrow, but also understanding. She said she hoped that Nathaniel would get the help he needed. On January 13, 2000, Nathaniel Abraham was placed in the care of the Michigan Department of Human Services. He was transferred to Maxie Boys Training School, a maximum security juvenile facility. The state had less than 8 years to rehabilitate him before his 21st birthday, and for a while the signs were encouraging. By August of 2000, Nate began showing signs of responsibility. Throughout 2001, he passed all of his classes and was praised for academic performance in math, reading, and note-keeping. By 2003, supervisors described him as a leader within his group. He displayed a positive attitude. He took on additional work. He followed directions. At 17, he was placed in a work program at a Goodwill store. His employers reported that he displayed good communication skills and was courteous with customers. On December 18th, at the age of 18, Nathaniel earned his GED. The following year, he earned a high school diploma. On paper, the rehabilitation was working, but the paper was not telling the whole story. Nate had anger issues, persistent ones. He got into fights in the facility, not because he started them, but because he could not walk away from them. He yelled at prison staff during basketball games and any competitive activity. He had a pattern of escalating when challenged, and he was caught more than once stealing cleaning supplies to give to his girlfriend. These were treated as missteps, normal for a youth in detention, and in fairness, they were lesser offenses than the ones that had defined his childhood. He was no longer committing arson. He was no longer assaulting people with steel pipes. He was no longer carrying a weapon. The system decided it was enough. On January 18, 2007, after spending nearly a decade in juvenile detention, Nathaniel Abraham was released. He was 21 years old. He was a free man. Footage from that day showed him smiling, wearing a flashy suit with red shoes and a fedora, hugging well-wishers and vowing to live a crime-free life. He was photographed on the steps of the facility, looking nothing like the small boy in oversized prison garb who had sobbed in a courtroom 8 years earlier. He looked confident. He looked like someone who had turned a corner. The cameras captured a young man who appeared ready for a second chance. The cameras did not follow him home. For the first 18 months after his release, nothing happened. No arrests, no incidents, no news stories. Nathaniel Abraham lived quietly in Pontiac, and the country stopped paying attention. Then, in May of 2008, he was arrested. Police found him in Pontiac with 254 ecstasy pills in a liquor bottle bag. He was sentenced to 4 to 20 years in prison for delivery of a controlled substance. The rehabilitation had lasted 18 months. He was paroled in June of 2017. His parole was discharged in July of 2018. In August of 2018, less than a month after being discharged from parole, Nate was arrested again. He had exposed himself in front of a 46-year-old neighbor who had declined his offer to cut her lawn. 2 days after that, he struck deputies who tried to take him into custody for skipping a court appearance. He was charged with resisting and obstructing police. In 2019, at the age of 33, Nathaniel Abraham was arrested again, this time for selling heroin and methamphetamine to an undercover police officer in Farmington Hills. He pleaded guilty. He was charged as a habitual offender, fourth offense, a designation that could carry a sentence of up to life in prison. The judge sentenced him to 6 to 40 years. Before the sentence was read, Nate addressed the court. He said he wanted to apologize for his actions. He said he took full responsibility. He turned to his family, his mother, his siblings, his relatives, all of whom had come to the courtroom, and said he was sorry for disappointing them. His defense attorney called the sentence extraordinarily lenient, given that a life sentence had been on the table. His 8-month-old son was in the courtroom. When the cameras turned to Gloria Abraham, the same mother who had begged police for help when Nate was 9, who had turned in his gun, who had watched every courtroom proceeding for 20 years, she was unwavering. She said she believed in her son. She said society did not know his life. She said he would be okay. She called him a strong young man. She had been saying versions of the same thing since 1997. To fully grasp what happened to Nathaniel Abraham after November 16, 1999, you have to understand the legal architecture that had been constructed around him, the system he was now trapped inside. Michigan's 1996 juvenile justice overhaul was not an accident. It was a deliberate legislative choice made during a specific moment in American politics. The mid-1990s were the peak of the super predator era, a period in which criminologists, politicians, and media commentators warned that a new generation of remorseless, ultra-violent juvenile offenders was emerging from America's inner cities. The language was inflammatory, the predictions were dire, and the policy response was severe. Under Michigan's statute, the prosecutor had virtually unfettered discretion to decide when to charge a juvenile as an adult. There was no minimum age. The only requirement was probable cause, determined by a judge at a preliminary hearing. This meant the decision to send an 11-year-old into the adult criminal justice system was not made by a panel of experts, not reviewed by child psychologists, and not subject to any special developmental assessment. It was made by a single prosecutor in a single county office, acting under a law that gave them the authority to do so. When the constitutionality of this statute was later challenged on appeal, the Michigan Court of Appeals upheld it, ruling that juveniles had no constitutional right to remain in juvenile court. The court found that the legislature's decision to set no minimum age was a policy choice, not a constitutional violation. In other words, the system worked exactly as it was designed to work. The question was whether it should have been designed that way in the first place. The law instructed courts to weigh factors like the child's maturity, school performance, and home environment, but only if a formal hearing was held. And those factors were advisory, not binding. A judge could consider them and still send the child to adult court. The statute was structured to lean toward prosecution, not protection. Nathaniel Abraham was not the first child affected by this law, but he became its most visible consequence. His prosecution was the test case that the statute's drafters had theoretically enabled, but perhaps never truly imagined. An 11-year-old sitting in an adult courtroom facing the prospect of dying in prison. While the legal system treated Nathaniel as an adult, the scientific evidence told a different story entirely. Developmental neuroscience has established that the brain regions responsible for impulse control, decision-making, and understanding consequences, primarily the prefrontal cortex, do not fully mature until the mid-20s. This is not speculation. It is measurable. It is observable on brain imaging, and it applies to every human being, regardless of their background or behavior. In an 11-year-old child, these structures are in the earliest stages of development. The capacity for what the law calls mens rea, the guilty mind, the intent to commit a crime, depends on cognitive functions that an 11-year-old brain is physically incapable of performing at an adult level. Nathaniel Abraham was not merely young, he was developmentally impaired. His IQ of 70 placed him in the borderline range of intellectual functioning. Psychologists who examined him consistently found that his emotional and cognitive maturity were equivalent to a child of 6 or 7. He did not fully understand the Miranda rights that were read to him. He did not fully understand the proceedings he was subjected to. He could not process the finality of what he had done in the way that an adult processes death. This is not a defense of the act. Ronnie Green is dead regardless of what Nathaniel Abraham's brain could or could not process. But the science matters because the law is supposed to account for it. The entire premise of a juvenile justice system is the recognition that children are different from adults, that they are more impulsive, more susceptible to influence, less capable of foresight, and more capable of change. The United States Supreme Court would eventually codify this principle in landmark rulings, holding in Roper v. Simmons that juveniles have a lack of maturity and an underdeveloped sense of responsibility, and in Graham v. Florida, barring life without parole for non-homicide juvenile offenders. These decisions came after Abraham's trial, but the science they relied on was available in 1999. It was presented in the courtroom. It was heard by the jury. The jury convicted him anyway. The trial was not happening in a vacuum. It was happening on television. It was happening in newspapers. It was happening on talk shows and in editorial pages and on the floor of the Michigan State Legislature. CBS's 60 Minutes profiled the case. The Los Angeles Times, the Washington Post, the New York Times, and every major wire service covered it. CBS News described Abraham as the youngest person in modern times to be convicted of murder. The coverage followed a pattern. National outlets used Nathaniel's case as a symbol in the broader debate over juvenile justice. He was, depending on which outlet you watched, either proof that young offenders needed to face adult consequences, or proof that the American legal system had lost its capacity for mercy. Amnesty International featured Nathaniel's face on the cover of a 1998 report about American juvenile justice practices, making him a symbol of what the organization called a system that was far too harsh on juveniles. In Michigan, the case prompted community action. Before sentencing, hundreds gathered outside the detention center where Abraham was held. Clergy, civil rights leaders, NAACP officials, and even the singer Anita Baker participated in vigils urging the judge to show mercy. Police Chief Michael Peterson, who had earlier called the juvenile justice law barbaric, spoke at community forums. Conservative commentators, meanwhile, pointed to Nate's record and argued that sympathy was misplaced. They described him as a menace. They cited the 22 police encounters. They emphasized the bragging after the shooting. They argued that this was not a case of a child making a mistake. It was a case of a child who had been making mistakes for years, escalating each time until someone died. Both sides had evidence to support their position. That was what made the case so difficult. The question that hung over Nathaniel's detention was whether the juvenile system could do what every other system in his life had failed to do: change him. Maxie Boys Training School was a maximum security juvenile facility in Whitmore Lake, Michigan. It was not a therapeutic camp. It was a locked institution designed to house the state's most serious juvenile offenders. The environment was structured and controlled. Days followed a rigid schedule. There were classes, counseling sessions, and behavioral assessments. For the first time in his life, Nathaniel Abraham was in a setting where adults were consistently present, expectations were clearly defined, and consequences were immediate. The irony was not lost on observers. The first stable structure he had ever experienced came in the form of incarceration. His progress, when it came, was real, but uneven. The academic improvement was genuine. His counselors reported periods of engagement, moments where Nate seemed to understand that his life could be different. But those moments were interrupted by flashes of the old patterns, the outbursts, the inability to manage frustration, the reflexive aggression when he felt challenged or disrespected. His supervisors documented everything, the good and the bad, the days he showed leadership and the days he had to be restrained, the semesters he passed and the incidents where he screamed at staff over a basketball call. The portrait that emerged was not one of transformation. It was one of a young man who had learned the rules of a controlled environment without necessarily internalizing the values behind them. He could follow directions when the structure demanded it. The question was what would happen when the structure was removed. The answer came with terrible speed. When Nathaniel Abraham walked out of Maxie Boys Training School in January of 2007, he walked back into the same city, the same neighborhood, and the same circumstances that had produced him. Pontiac had not changed in his absence. The poverty was still there. The lack of opportunity was still there. The same street corners, the same liquor stores, the same broken sidewalks. The country had moved on. By 2007, the Abraham case was old news. There were new crises, new tragedies, new debates. The cameras that had followed his release captured a brief moment of optimism and then disappeared. What followed was a pattern that would become grimly familiar. 18 months of quiet, then arrests, then prison, then parole, then another arrest, then more prison. The cycle repeated with the regularity of a mechanism. Each time the charges were different: drugs, assault on a prison guard, indecent exposure, resisting arrest. But the pattern was the same: freedom, followed by self-destruction, followed by incarceration. Each arrest brought a wave of news coverage, and each story began the same way. Nathaniel Abraham, who was convicted of murder at the age of 11, has been arrested again. His childhood crime had become his permanent identifier. No matter what he did or failed to do, the first sentence of every article about him would always reference the shooting. He was 11 years old when it happened. He will be associated with it for the rest of his life. Those who believed in rehabilitation pointed to systemic failures, the lack of support after release, the absence of transitional housing, the near impossibility of finding employment with a murder conviction on your record, even one from childhood. They argued that releasing a young man with an IQ of 70 into the same environment that had produced him, with no meaningful support network, was not a fair test of rehabilitation. It was a setup. Those who had opposed leniency from the beginning pointed to the same pattern and said, "We told you so." Both sides again had evidence. This story has been told, retold, and debated for more than 2 decades. It has been examined through the lens of juvenile justice reform, developmental neuroscience, prosecutorial overreach, racial disparity, and the failure of social systems to protect vulnerable children. But at the center of all of it, before the law, before the politics, before the cameras, there is a fact that gets lost. Ronnie Greene Jr. was 18 years old. He was standing outside a store. He was talking with his friends, and a bullet came from somewhere he could not see and hit him in the head. He died the next day. He did not know Nathaniel Abraham. He had done nothing to provoke the shooting. He was not in the wrong place at the wrong time. He was standing in front of a store in his own neighborhood. His mother, Robin Adams, sat through the trial. She listened to experts debate her son's killer's IQ. She listened to lawyers argue over whether an 11-year-old could form intent. She listened to a country argue about the law while her son was in the ground. When the verdict came down, she said she hoped Nathaniel would get help. She was, by all accounts, more generous than the situation required. The question the Nathaniel Abraham case leaves behind is not whether he should have been punished. He should have. A person died. The question is, what kind of society produces an 11-year-old capable of picking up a rifle and firing at a stranger? And whether the answer to that question can be found in a courtroom. Gloria Abraham asked for help before the shooting. She went to the police. She went to the courts. She turned in a weapon. She was sent in circles until there were no more circles to run. 22 encounters with police by the age of 11. Not one resulted in meaningful intervention. A juvenile justice law with no minimum age. A prosecutor willing to use it on a child whose feet could not reach the floor of the courtroom. A rehabilitation program that lasted 8 years, followed by 18 months of freedom, followed by decades of reoffending. Michigan eventually changed its laws. By the late 2010s, the state had raised the minimum age for adult prosecution. No child under 14 can now be sent to adult court in the state. These reforms were driven in part by the questions that Nathaniel Abraham's case made impossible to ignore. But the reforms came too late for Ronnie Green, and they came too late for Nathaniel Abraham. The legal scholars who studied this case wrote about it in law reviews and journals. They dissected the statute. They analyzed the appellate decisions. They debated mens rea and juvenile competency and the developmental capacity of pre-adolescent children. Their work contributed to a gradual shift in how America thinks about young offenders, but none of it brought Ronnie Green back, and none of it changed the trajectory Nathaniel Abraham was already on. The people who worked inside the system, the prosecutors, the judges, the defense attorneys, the social workers, the counselors at Maxie, all had different answers for what went wrong and when. Some pointed to the moment the rifle was fired. Others pointed to the years before, when every institution that should have intervened chose not to. Some pointed to the law itself. Others pointed to the neighborhood. Others pointed to a mother who worked 2 jobs and still could not keep her youngest son off the streets. The truth is that no single answer is sufficient. What happened on October 29, 1997, was the result of a cascade, a series of failures, large and small, institutional and personal, that accumulated over years until they became irreversible. A father who left, a mother who could not be present, a school system that did not flag the warning signs, a police department that documented 22 encounters without once initiating a meaningful intervention, a juvenile court that turned a desperate mother away, a neighborhood that watched a child spiral and could do nothing about it, a legislature that wrote a law without a floor, and a prosecutor who used it. Each of these failures was small enough to be excused on its own. Taken together, they were catastrophic. Judge Moore said at sentencing that society must invest in troubled youth before they turn into adult offenders. It was a statement that everyone agreed with and no one acted on in time. Nathaniel Abraham is now in his late 30s. He is serving a 6 to 40-year sentence for drug trafficking. His earliest possible release date is sometime in the 2020s. His mother still supports him. His son is growing up without him. The cycle that began on a block in Pontiac in 1986 has now extended into a second generation. Ronnie Green was buried in 1997. He was 18. His mother sat through 2 years of legal proceedings, listened to a country argue about whether her son's killer was old enough to be held responsible, and then watched the debate move on without her. The law that made Nathaniel Abraham's trial possible has been rewritten. The city of Pontiac has continued to struggle. The debate about trying children as adults has not been settled, and the distance between a cluster of trees and a convenience store, roughly 280 feet, remains the same. Some distances do not change. In the years since the Abraham trial, the United States has slowly, unevenly reconsidered how it treats its youngest offenders. The super predator theory that drove the legislation of the 1990s has been widely discredited. The neuroscience that defense experts presented in Nathaniel's courtroom in 1999 has become mainstream. Courts at every level now routinely consider adolescent brain development when evaluating juvenile sentences. But the damage done during that era has not been undone. Thousands of children were prosecuted as adults during the 1990s and early 2000s under laws modeled on the same principles as Michigan's. Many of them are still in prison. Many of them were sentenced to terms that will outlast their natural lives. And many of them came from neighborhoods that looked exactly like the one Nathaniel Abraham grew up in. The Abraham case did not create those conditions. It revealed them. It held them up to a national spotlight for a brief, uncomfortable moment, and then the spotlight moved on. The conditions remained. That is perhaps the most unsettling part of this story. Not the shooting itself, not the trial, not the sentence, but the fact that, in the end, nothing about this story was truly unusual. A child in poverty, a system that ignored the warning signs, a violent act that could have been prevented, a legal response that satisfied no one. The only thing unusual about Nathaniel Abraham was his age, and even that, in a country that had already decided to treat children as adults, was less remarkable than it should have been. There is an image from the trial that circulated widely at the time. In it, Nathaniel sits at the defense table, his feet dangling above the floor because the chair is too tall for him. His hands are folded, his eyes are wide. He looks like what he is, a child in a room built for adults, surrounded by a process designed for people 3 times his age, answering for an act that the adults in his life should have seen coming and did not stop. That is what most people remember: the dangling feet, the oversized courtroom, the small boy swallowed by a system that was never meant for someone his size. What they do not remember is Ronnie Green. They do not remember that he was 18, that he had a mother who loved him, that he was standing outside a store on a Wednesday evening, doing nothing wrong when a bullet found him from 280 feet away. Both things are true at the same time: a child who should have been saved, a teenager who should have survived. Neither one was.